Well, firstly, thank you for your time. My name is James Stevenson. I'm the Principal Sales Engineer for Solera Networks, and I'm going to be spending the next 20 to 30 minutes giving you a high-level overview of the threat landscape from my perspective. And also, I'm going to be talking about the fact that breaches are inevitable. There's nothing you can do about that. And once you accept that fact, I'm going to discuss generically two key methodologies for breach discovery. Not many presentations start off with pictures of cows and fields, so let me explain myself. I graduated 10 years ago, full of life and irritating enthusiasm, as my wife says. Symantec saw it fit to completely destroy all my social skills and then stuck me in a decommissioned nuclear bunker for about 5 years, staring at the Matrix. But this gave me a very good operations background and the status quo that we use in terms of traditional technologies. After that, I finally escaped and then spent 2 years managing a global telco's IDS, IPS, and SIM infrastructure. And for the past 3 years, I've been installing security intelligence and analytic solutions, which essentially are systems that just record everything, like a security camera on your network, because you don't know when you're going to need that. So I spent 3 years looking at kind of zero-day malware on customer sites, identifying sensitive data leakage, and also determining the root cause of a breach to actually understand how to plug that gap, change your policies and mitigate that risk. So in terms of the current threat landscape, I'll be very brief. I'm sure there's been many presentations on this. But the key point for me is we're heavily reliant on signature-based technologies, IDS, antivirus, IPS, and we do need those. And these are proven technologies at detecting known publicly disclosed attacks and exploits. But they actually have almost zero effectiveness against the unknown. And that's where the problem lies. Let me just get my... That's where the problem lies. About a third of malware is customized. That is, there is no signature when they're being used to detect those. And because we're heavily relying on those signature technologies, they're going under the radar. In terms of the attacker, it's way beyond our current ability. I've got some useful stats from the Verizon Data Breach Report. Hands up that's seen that 2012 report. Okay, I've got some very useful, not too many. It's a free report that you can just Google. It's got some very interesting stats. One of the key things is, I'm going to focus on large organizations here, but about 72% of organizations fall within minutes. And that's actually typically using canned attacks and scripting it. And also, 96% of those attacks aren't really difficult. And that comes on nicely to my next point, this term advanced persistent threats. Everyone's using it, it's in all the marketing material. I've spent a lot of time with various intelligence entities across EMEA, and one of them in particular, we have this running joke together where there's nothing really advanced about it. It's pretty much adequate or just enough to compromise a network. It doesn't take very much. In terms of the malware that we're dealing with, they're pervasive by nature, and they're leveraging paths of trust. So just to give you an example, you put a firewall in place to block illegitimate communication, but you have a business to run. So you open up port 80 or 8080 for your web traffic. Oh, we need to send email, so I open up port 25. Well, people don't know the IP address of Google, so I've got to open up port 53 UDP to do my DNS queries. Now the attackers are obviously leveraging those paths of trust in your firewall rule sets. Once they get a foothold in your network, they are just utilizing your actual legitimate communication channels to perform data leakage, malware downloads, etc. If you look at the, so actually I used to work for RSA during the time of the breach. There's a lot of public information about that, but what you'll notice is, there's an email from a trusted source, so why wouldn't they click on it? Once that system is compromised, it's a routine process of hash dump and lateral movement. But once they find the data they want, they actually leak it out over legitimate FTP channels. So you've got data being leaked over common channels. They're conforming to RFC protocols. It just looks like any other legitimate traffic hiding in plain sight. Also, it's extremely difficult to determine the true root cause. So your IDS and AV might do a great job and say, oh, I've detected an EXE piece of code being transferred or some kind of buffer overflow, but it won't tell you what happened a day before that signature was triggered. So there's no context before and after. And also, when you're talking about breaches and malware, a lot of people have this mindset that it's just a bit of code you can remove, nuke the system from orbit and I'm good. People need to take a step back and think, well, this is a human adversary It's probably been entrenched in my network for quite a large period of time. And if you just remove that piece of malware, they're going to have other backdoors and other avenues to get in and out of your network. Again, if you go back to the RSA breach, there was an initial compromise, then there's a reverse connection out. So if the user or the attacker tries to connect in, your firewall will do its job. Get that system compromised, have a reverse connection out. And once he's established that channel into your network, he's then going to have other avenues because he knows you're going to find them eventually. So as I've mentioned, a third of malware is customized. Now what's really scary here that I'm going to discuss is the windows of opportunity. So 85% of breaches took weeks or more to discover. So imagine malware running around your network for weeks or months. And I've got one example of something called the Begman Trojan, a variant I found actually in February last year, but still very current. And it took 8 months for the antivirus companies to build a signature for something that I discovered by being more proactive. And that's something I'm going to discuss in a minute. And also the good news is, I spent 3 years kind of evangelizing the need not to heavily rely on traditional technologies, though they are part of your defense in-depth strategy. But luckily, hopefully everyone in this room realizes that they have a place, but you can't heavily rely on that. What's really interesting, actually, is the decline in custom malware. So 2010 and 2011, about, say, 2/3 of malware was customized. But actually, surprisingly, in this year, for 2012, there's been a massive drop. Now only 1/3 of malware is customized. And a lot of people try to understand why. I think one of the things is, a lot of our industrial environments are now leveraging commercial software, so then they can then apply those kind of exploits and vulnerabilities associated with that commercial software. They don't have to think of like Stuxnet and the amount of customization required to compromise those networks. It's not as needed anymore. And also, think of the attacker's perspective. Why invest a significant amount of time and money finding zero-day vulnerabilities to exploit networks when canned off-the-shelf malware packs do the job just as effectively? Let me give you an example of how easy it is to basically get past your current defenses. So just say hello world was an exploit, okay? There's a bit of JavaScript which is unpacked. The vendors out there will then think, okay, there's a new attack, this is what the signature looks like, so I'm going to build a signature and then deploy that across my entire customer base. Well, the attacker, once they're up to speed on this new threat, if the attacker just uses that unpacked version, where it says document write, this is very simple, by the way, but your defenses are going to light up like a Christmas tree. But they don't want to have to rebuild that. So they just simply repack that same code, they obfuscate. And for example, I've got a very simple example of the Dean Edwards JavaScript packer, which hopefully summarizes how easy it is to obfuscate. So if we use the Dean Edwards JavaScript packer, it turns out document.write hello world, which is what we're looking for in our signature, and converts it into that string below. So when the attacker uses that, it doesn't match the signature, goes straight under the radar. This is a massive generalization, but it just gives you an idea. And the attacker is kind of back to 0 days. They just repack it multiple times, so the signature doesn't match, and they just keep one step ahead of the vendors. And it's just a reiterative process, really. So the challenge is keeping pace. So the attacker has the initiative. They choose where, they choose when, they choose how. They're always going to be one step ahead of us. And think about the situation that the AV guys and the IDS guys are in. It's not their fault. There's 100,000 bits of malware released every single day. It's a real big challenge to try and keep pace. I don't know why I'm using this when I have this, but going back to the windows of opportunity, what's really startling here is from an attack to a compromise takes within seconds or minutes through scripting. It's about, as I said, 72% of large organizations are compromised extremely quickly. Actually, getting data out after that takes a little bit longer, but the initial compromise is quite quick. You contrast that to the internal team determining that there's a breach. It takes weeks, months, and even years. And actually, funnily enough, also 72%. So there's a massive window of opportunity until they're recognized. And it's only until you recognize them you can then react to that. So what are we doing about it? What I find really interesting here is we're very good at building policies and strategies to recognize these threats and determine how we're going to deal with that. But a lot of companies are confirming that we have the right plan, but we're not investing in the security technology to deal with these advanced threats. We're not investing in very specialist security skill sets or training the current security teams to go beyond that, just staring at a screen, waiting for a signature to be triggered. Trying to teach them to be more proactive in their kind of analysis. one example is, well, why is there a small packed obfuscated exe being downloaded from a .co.uk domain, but the server's physically located in China? Ask those questions, and I'll go into that in just a moment. And as we all know, it's nothing like an expensive breach for people to refocus their efforts and then finally invest in the security technologies and teams to really meet their strategy that they've defined. Yeah, so I've kind of briefly discovered the various key breaches. I've kind of really discussed the RSA one, but that's why we are seeing so many breaches at the moment. So just accept the fact that breaches are going to happen. The only question is how you're going to deal with it. And when there is a breach, the typical dreaded questions from the CISO, who did this to this? How did it happen? Can we be sure it's over? And if you're relying on those traditional technologies, you really don't have all the information to hand. You have gaps in your knowledge and visibility. So the usual answer is, we still don't know. And as an ex-security analyst, that's really frustrating. I want to have all the intelligence available. So not only can I say there's an indication of a breach, but I can say, oh, they clicked, they got a phishing email, they clicked the link, then they were redirected to this site that had some iframe or JavaScript that sent them to another site. That site had obfuscated JavaScript that compiled some shellcode. That compromised the system and left the back door. Now I can see the transfer over that back door. To have that intelligence, that's really where we would need to be. But the answer at the moment is we still don't know. When we get a question like this, I was Googling the other day, and Senator Paul, I think he was running for president, and he got a very difficult question and said, that's a good question, let me try and evade you. I think that's brilliant. There are a lot of people out there that would prefer to stick their head in the sand and actually not deal with the issue. This is where the likes of Forrester and Gartner are talking about the space of security, intelligence, and analytics. Just get your head out of the bucket of sand, stick it on a swivel, and kind of get that full visibility. I will use this. There we go. Now, what's interesting here with breach discovery methods is that, look at the large orgs here. 50% of your breaches are actually determined from an external third party, i.e. your customer. What does that tell you about your internal security tool sets in place at the moment? And what I find very interesting here is if you purely rely on those IDS, IPS, AV technologies, you do need those because they're a quick win. But if you purely rely on that with large entities, only 16% of breaches are discovered by that means alone. And that's really what I'm trying to emphasize. You need that as part of your defense and depth strategy. You put these devices in that can block and prevent because they know what to look for. And that's 16% of your issues out of the way. So you definitely need that. But look at the effectiveness of something called internal passive security. That's where the analysts that have all the information, like logs that might be correlated by a SIM, and they're going to go out of their way, put everything down, and kind of on a hunch think, I know this network. I have tribal knowledge of this network. I shouldn't be seeing this transfer between these two entities, and I shouldn't be seeing this type of file being downloaded. And it's by asking those kinds of questions and kind of turning over those stones, you will find stuff before the vendors provide you with those signatures that we heavily rely on. So essentially two approaches. The first one that we're all heavily using is reactive-based security. So essentially, the security analyst might be doing their reading and getting up to speed on the threat landscape and the latest malware, or just read up about an IE9 vulnerability, for example, and they're familiar with that, but they're still just sitting there waiting for their vendors to provide the latest signatures, etc. And then when that is triggered, that kicks off their incident response process, okay? And then they react. And again, that delay could be days, weeks, or months until those vendors provide that. So, as I said, a quick win, 60% of effectiveness in terms of breach discovery can be done that way. But I suggest that you also start focusing more on the proactive-based security. Now, this is where an analyst makes the assumption that, look, the IDS is doing a great job, but there's going to be stuff that's going to go under based on my understanding of obfuscation and stuff that we've just discussed, packing, etc. So I'm going to take that as a baseline. And I'm actually going to go out of my way manually to try and find stuff that hasn't been flagged with maybe my security operations center. And they will just manually analyze based on all the intelligence that's available to them. Okay? And this is really a way of looking at what we call unknown threats. Now, actually, in large organizations, that actually has 28% of breach discovery effectiveness. So if you combine those two, it's a very large win. But not enough of us are actually utilizing this proactive-based security. And that's really because it's manually intensive, it's expensive. You know, we've got maybe an analyst team that have so many roles in their day-to-day lives. They don't have time to go out of their way looking for a needle in a stack of needles. My point is, though, that you simply need to do that. And also, actually, if I go back one, if you look at these smaller organizations, look, 92% of breaches are discovered by external parties. They have a very immature security operations strategy, and as you can see, even internal passive and active, there's hardly any detection through that. But I want to focus on the larger organizations. You can see that that approach, though it's more manually intensive, has a much better success rate than relying on those active approaches. Okay. So my point here is, both approaches are vital as part of our defense in depth. But what we need for both of those is security intelligence and context. What happened before? What happened after? What was the root cause? Okay, you've seen a buffer overflow, but was there any data leakage 10 minutes afterwards? Those kind of questions. Now, by giving you unparalleled intelligence, by recording everything, you can actually improve the effectiveness of both those reactive and proactive approaches. And this is actually a new space that Gartner and Forrester have been terming or coining SIA, Security Intelligence and Analytics, or Network Analysis and Visibility. So record everything, so you don't know, because you don't know when you're going to need it. And when you do get intelligence on your desk, you think, well, I've got 2 weeks of forensic retention. Now I know this new command and control center, or I knew this new signature. I'm going to go back in time and reanalyze what I've been recording. The most highest use case of this kind of technology is proactive situational awareness. But as I said, it costs time and money. But the most common use case is still that reactive approach. So imagine your IDS flagging something of interest, and then you going back to your forensic suite to get context before and after that IDS or AV trigger. So going back to my bunker days, I've got a great example. This was 10 years ago and still valid today, where I woke up a system owner at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, I've looked at your firewall rules and your logs, your IDS, your AV. I've correlated that all together. And I can confirm there has been some kind of Nmap scan as a reconnaissance precursor, followed by a buffer overflow. And I remember the system owner said, that's great, James. He's pretty grumpy because it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I've woken him up. That's great, but what happened before? What happened a day or an hour before that? Was there any data leakage afterwards? And it's very frustrating because I can't provide that answer. So the customer, when I was at Symantec, was frustrated. I was frustrated. I wanted to give that to them. And if you imagine something that's recording everything, it kind of complements all those technologies in terms of context. So this is the key. 10 years ago, and we still have the same problem. Now add context to that scenario. So you have an IDS in place, like SourceFire. It's doing its job. You actually see a SourceFire alert that's been triggered that says, I have seen shellcode being transferred generically across your network. So it's not mapping it to a particular piece of malware. It's seeing maybe the MZ value or the MS-DOS loader. And it's saying, I've seen some code. Now, when I was in the bunker, that's what I would have saw, but I've got no context around that event. So I would then say, well, show me everything involving the attacker, which is the 10.13158 address, and the victim, the 1072. Show me everything I've ever recorded. Let's try and profile those two entities. So before I didn't give any context. Now imagine going back forensically and saying, okay, well, 1 minute past 4, someone received an instant message over instant messenger, and someone said, click this link. I've immaturely named this pwned, but yeah, you get the point. Someone then clicked that link, because 4 minutes later, there was a GET request for that resource. And then that user, when they went to that site, they were actually redirected to a new location. This is a typical attack vector that we see all the time in terms of drive-by exploits, etc. And then you can see the system automatically, on behalf of the user, then getting that other resource that's been moved to this location. And then that web server then delivered some HTML. Then we can look at the code of that and say, this looks like obfuscated JavaScript. And actually, this JavaScript example actually does compile some shellcode, drops it onto the system, and then there's a backdoor running on that system. And that's just from clicking an IM link or a spear phishing link. There's also some embedded iframe as well, pointing to an image file. So imagine having that context. That's much better for an analyst and for your team to understand was the user being stupid? Were they forcibly redirected? Now, what was the root cause so we can see if we can plug that gap? an alert saying I've seen an exe file being transferred doesn't really help me. It's an indicator of a breach, but I need to now mitigate that. Have that kind of intelligence. That's something you can work with. Let me go back one. OK, so we see the obfuscated JavaScript that's been delivered. And then after that, then that exe, now the attacker knows, because they clicked on that link, it's now got a backdoor running on port 4444. And that is where the source fire, going back to the original technology, saw that exe transfer over that unusual port. Now again, let's provide more context. Let's take the MD5 SHA-1 hash of that file and then see, does VirusTotal recognize that? Hands up that uses VirusTotal on a daily basis. No one? Go on. OK, so VirusTotal is like having 43 antivirus vendors on your side. So take the hash of that file that your IDS picked up, go to VirusTotal and see, does anyone in the intelligence community flag this file? So the IDS would have said, it looks like an exe file that's been transferred, but now you're saying, I know what variant this is, whether it's 0 day. And that's important. Imagine that you're purely relying on, I'll pick on McAfee. Say they're purely relying on McAfee, and you do a VirusTotal check, and McAfee isn't one of those AV vendors that currently flag that malware. Well, that's 0 day in the context of your environment. For another customer that might be using, say, Microsoft Essentials, they would have flagged it up as the SWORD Trojan, which is a small file manager for uploading data for leakage and then downloading second stage malware, etc. And then afterwards, we can actually see 2 minutes later, after the IDS triggered that event, we can actually see someone uploading a Word document to tinyfile.alamo.com. This is, hopefully you can see the difference when you start combining that kind of reactive technology with context. Okay. So the key thing here is get context, determine a root cause so you can mitigate it for future events, try and plug that gap. And it's not about prevention. You can't block what you don't know. It's about damage limitation, finding it as early as you can to close down that window of opportunity and then mitigate it. So my final one is the proactive side of things, where you're not waiting for that signature to be triggered. And this is referring to my Begman Trojan I just stumbled on in pure luck on a massive network last year. Now my key point here is, don't focus on auto-detecting breach indicators. Just ask yourself as an analyst, as I said earlier, why is there an EXE that's small, that's packed with, morphine or cryptex, UPX, and why is that coming from Russia or China? I'm being a bit obvious there, but I think in this one, I think it was Germany actually. But ask yourself, why am I seeing this? Why is it being downloaded? Why isn't it being blocked? What is it doing? So take that file and sandbox it. Don't wait for everyone else. So the point here is, an exe file on its own doesn't mean anything. Maybe traffic from China doesn't mean anything. But when you have one session and a combination of those meta attributes correlate, then that's a very compelling event. It still doesn't mean it's malicious, but it definitely warrants further investigation. And that's how I, in my 10 years, how I try and find that needle in a stack of needles. I just look for a combination of meta attributes in one session and think, there's something not quite right there. It's worthy of investigation. And it might be fine, it might not. So look at the Begman example. So I found this on, actually it was February 21st. Found a file being downloaded from skygameu.com. The domain had been up for like 4 days, and it was an exe file that was packed. So, some very interesting attributes. So I took that file, game.exe, and uploaded it to VirusTotal. This was 2 days later. It shows that only 4 of the 43 antivirus vendors flagged this as malicious. Now they were a strong McAfee. Actually, we partner with McAfee, but they all have the same challenge. But in this case, it's just McAfee. But in this case, McAfee, they were heavily reliant on McAfee. McAfee didn't flag it, so it's 0 day for their environment. I then rescanned that about 14 hours later, and you can see that the intelligence community is sharing, they're building signatures together, and you can see now that 8 out of the 43 vendors flag it. Again, in this case, McAfee still didn't flag it. About a month later, I didn't know what I had at this time. About a month later, Microsoft published this new Begman Trojan report, this was about a month later. It allows, it does keylogging. You have remote control of the host. You can upload and download files. Now, even then, I actually checked it with Microsoft Essentials, and they didn't detect the variant that I had stumbled on. So they found a new family of Trojans, but they didn't find the one I stumbled on just by pure luck. And then, as you can see, also on March 20th, a much better detection rate. About 60% of the AV community now flag it. But again, for this particular customer, McAfee didn't flag it. And obviously at this point, they're on the phone to McAfee, why haven't you built a signature for us? And they're maybe building a custom signature for their environment, and they did that. Now, actually, it took 8 months in this example for this AV vendor to build a signature for something I flagged up in February by being more proactive, asking those questions. So if you purely relied on a reactive approach, you'd be waiting for 8 months, signature released or an AV signature. You then see that running around laterally across your network. You then react. That's been running around for 8 months. By being more proactive, yes, it's time resource, it's time intensive, but in this example, close that window of opportunity by 8 months. And this is the point I'm making here. I think I'm almost out of time. The attack begins. You typically identify the attack, again, when those vendors provide those updates. But in this particular example, which is why I've been using this for almost over a year, it's still the same case today. I mean, I find this kind of malware every single day on customer networks. But it's just about being proactive and closing that window from 8 months to, in this case, 2 days. Okay? So don't just wait for signatures. Be more proactive. I was trying to find, I remember this really, really good quote, actually, and I was really disappointed that it's actually from Lord of the Rings. But it's saying about, you can't, a breach is inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. All we can do is decide what to do with the time that's given to us. Actually, my colleague thought it was from Star Trek, actually. But I just think this is, a really good example of, just accept it. But, we have control on what we're going to do about it. And on that basis, I say get rid of all the users. I think that's the best way to stop compromising your network. I don't know if you guys have seen this on YouTube, but there was someone that got the question, which of the following is the biggest, the elephant or a moon? And they chose the elephant. I'm sure we have people like this in all our companies. So be very fearful, because it only takes someone like that to click an email or an IM and then compromise the network, as I've showed with my example. But imagine having all that unparalleled intelligence. And there's been a breach because of this Muppet user. The CISO says, was this breach caused by trust exploitation? Was it stupidity on the user's part? They need security awareness training. Were they just going to a legitimate site that had been compromised and they were forcibly redirected to a black hole exploit kit, for example? Was it out of their hands? And how can we mitigate that? So all I'm saying is, get security intelligence, get context, and then go find out. I think that's done. Thank you for putting up with my irritating enthusiasm. And thank you. I'd just like to say that I think I'm at the Stephen Bell suite. Yes. Yeah, so is it 3 o'clock? Yeah, so if anyone hasn't had enough of me, which I'm sure you all have, then I'm more than happy to discuss this in more detail at 3 o'clock at the Stephen Bell suite. So thank you very much.